A jagged crack splits the horizon as the salt-flat floor shatters beneath Eirik Vinterdal's boots. The guild-issued compass in his palm spins wildly, its needle melting into a puddle of useless lead. Above him, the twin moons of Aethelgard bleed a sickly violet light onto the barren crust. Eirik spits blood into the white dust, his eyes darting toward the encroaching wall of razor-sharp fog. He knows the truth now. His own commanders sent him here to die in the silence of the wastes. Death is not coming from the storm. It is already sitting in the pocket of his coat. Eirik scrambled backward as the ground beneath him groaned. A deep, rhythmic thrum vibrated through the soles of his boots. He clutched his chest, gasping as a sharp, piercing pain pulsed behind his right eye. The familiar sting of a stellar migraine flared, blurring his vision into a haze of white noise. He forced his breathing to slow, focusing on the faint, cold light of the distant stars. His fingers traced the air, mapping the invisible geometry of the heavens against the shifting earth. A blue window flickered into his mind, displaying coordinates that defied the guild's false maps. The numbers burned with a cold white light before fading into his subconscious. Eirik leaned against a protruding pillar of salt, his hands shaking with the effort of the calculation. He knew his location now, the heart of the forbidden shattered wilds. The guild had claimed this sector was a dead zone, devoid of any stable land. They had lied to keep the trade routes for themselves. The sound of heavy armored boots crunched against the salt crust nearby. Eirik froze, his hand dropping to the worn leather notebook tucked into his belt. A tall figure stepped out from the swirling mist, her silhouette framed by the violet moonlight. Thora Hrafn adjusted the heavy straps of her iron-plated pauldrons. Her eyes, cold and sharp as polished flint, scanned the horizon with predatory grace. She held an echo stone in her left hand, its surface dark and unresponsive in the anomaly. Thora stopped 10 paces away, her boots leaving deep impressions in the white powder. She looked at the broken compass in Eirik's hand and let out a dry, humorless laugh. Her gaze shifted to the horizon, where the fog storm swirled in a perfect, unnatural circle. She demanded to know how a disgraced hydrographer survived a path rigged for a total collapse. Eirik stood tall, hiding the tremor in his hands behind his back. He told her that the stars were the only map that did not require a bribe. Thora took a step forward, her hand resting on the hilt of her jagged steel blade. She sneered at his mention of the stars, dismissing his navigation as a fool's superstition. She knew the guild's technology was meant to lead him to a shallow grave. Her frustration simmered, visible in the way her jaw tightened beneath her leather cowl. She needed the data in his head, but she had no intention of letting him keep his life. Eirik watched her posture, noting the way she shifted her weight to favor her dominant strike. The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone and wet, stagnant earth. The fog storm surged forward, swallowing the distant pillars of salt in a hungry rush. Eirik glanced at the moons, noting their precise alignment with the northern rift. He had seconds to calculate a path through the labyrinth of the shifting salt flats. If he faltered, the magnetic pull of the wilds would tear his mind apart. If he succeeded, he would lead a wolf into his own sanctuary. Thora pulled her blade, the metal whistling as it cut through the thick, damp air. She commanded him to point the way forward or lose his hands to the frost. Eirik stared into the white expanse, his mind racing through the celestial drift. He visualized the network of ley lines hidden beneath the layer of salt and dust. The migraine hammered at his skull, a reminder of the cost of his clarity. He turned to Thora, his expression a mask of manufactured compliance. He gestured toward a narrow gap between two towering, jagged salt formations. The path looked like a suicide run into the heart of the oncoming fog. Thora hesitated, her eyes flickering between the safe-looking rock and his steady hand. She did not trust his eyes, but she trusted her own greed more. She shoved him forward with the flat of her blade, urging him into the shadows. Eirik stumbled, his boots sliding on the slick, crystalline surface of the ground. He kept his head down, counting the seconds between the pulsing of the stars. The terrain beneath them shifted, the ground moving like a slow, lethargic river of stone. Eirik adjusted his pace to match the rhythm of the continental drift. He kept his secrets safe, tucked away behind the wall of his burning, aching mind. Thora followed close behind, her eyes never leaving the back of his neck. She wanted his map, but she had no idea the cost of the path he chose. The canyon walls loomed overhead like the jagged teeth of a buried titan. Eirik gripped the rough, calcified stone to steady his trembling frame. His vision pulsed with the rhythmic, sickening throb of a brewing stellar migraine. He stared at the sky, squinting as the light of the distant void stars blurred into jagged smears of violet. Thora stood behind him, her hand resting heavy on the pommel of her blade. She tapped her echo stone, but the device emitted only a flat, dead static. The stone glowed with a faint, useless amber light that failed to cut through the oppressive gloom. Eirik forced his eyes to lock onto a constellation flickering near the northern ridge. He counted the seconds, his mind frantically triangulating their position against the shifting salt flats. A sharp metallic taste flooded his mouth as blood trickled from his left nostril. He wiped the stain away with his sleeve before Thora could notice the cost of his clarity. The ground beneath them groaned, the tectonic plates shifting with a low, grinding roar. Eirik stumbled, his knees buckling under the sudden violent weight of his own focus. He saw a series of glowing white coordinates burn into his retinas. They pointed toward a narrow, treacherous bridge of salt, suspended over an abyss of swirling fog. Thora stepped closer, her shadow falling over him like a shroud of iron. She demanded to know why the path ahead appeared as a jagged, impassable tear in the earth. Eirik gestured toward the alignment of the twin moons overhead. He explained that the map required the stars to bridge the physical gaps in the landscape. Thora narrowed her eyes, her gaze tracing the lines of his pale, sweating face. She scoffed, dismissing his celestial math as the desperate delusions of a broken man. She leaned in, her voice a cold whisper that carried the promise of an early grave. She warned him that the fogwalkers were already stirring in the depths below. Eirik looked down into the swirling gray mist, where pale, elongated shapes darted through the shadows. The creatures moved with a fluid, unnatural grace that defied the laws of the solid world. He turned back to Thora, his breath hitching as another wave of pain hammered his skull. He pointed to the salt bridge, claiming it was the only stable route across the rift. Thora shoved him forward, her armored glove digging into his shoulder. She ordered him to cross first, intending to use his body as a test for the unstable path. Eirik stepped onto the narrow span, the salt crunching like shattered glass beneath his boots. He kept his head bowed, his eyes closed to hide the cascading white noise of his migraine. Every step required a mental calculation that burned through his remaining cognitive reserves. He felt his memories of home flickering, the edges of his identity fraying into the void. Thora followed, her boots striking the salt with a heavy, arrogant rhythm. She watched his every move, her hand never leaving the hilt of her weapon. She seemed to know exactly where the traps lay, avoiding the soft spots that threatened to collapse. Eirik caught the subtle shift in her stride, a deliberate avoidance of the most dangerous sectors. He realized then that she possessed a hidden, accurate map of the region. She was not searching for a path, but verifying the one she already held. He was merely a key, a human compass required to unlock the final, locked gates. The salt bridge swayed, caught in the grip of a sudden, subterranean tremor. Eirik dropped to his hands and knees, his fingernails clawing into the crystalline surface. His vision went completely dark for a heart-stopping second. He saw the constellations shifting, their positions rearranged by the anomaly of the wilds. He pushed his mind outward, anchoring his consciousness to the light of a distant, dying sun. The pain in his head surged, a searing heat that felt like a blade behind his eyes. He gasped, his lungs burning with the thin, metallic air of the canyon floor. Thora stood over him, her face a mask of impatient, calculated cruelty. She poked his ribs with the tip of her boot, demanding he stand and continue the march. She told him that the guild had no patience for a navigator who could not see the way. Eirik forced himself upward, his muscles screaming in protest. He looked toward the far side of the abyss, where a structure of ancient dark metal stood embedded in the cliff. It was a beacon, long dormant, pulsing with the same frequency as his own internal rhythm. He knew that if he reached it, he could stabilize the path for himself and escape her reach. He took a shaky step, his eyes fixed on the faint, rhythmic glow of the distant machine. Thora trailed him, her eyes scanning the horizon for signs of the fogwalkers. The silence of the canyon was broken only by the sound of their labored, uneven breathing. Eirik felt his mind slipping again, the edges of his consciousness dissolving into the salt mist. He clutched his notebook to his chest, the leather worn smooth by his constant, desperate touch. He had to survive the crossing, even if it meant sacrificing the last of his memories. Thora laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed against the canyon walls. She told him that he was the most useful tool she had ever found in the wastes. Eirik kept his silence, his focus narrowing down to the next 3 feet of ground. He was a ghost walking through a graveyard, guided only by the dying light of the stars. He knew the truth about the guild's agenda now, and he knew he was already marked for disposal. He would lead her to the beacon, but he would not be there when she arrived. The fog storm surged, a wall of white vapor rushing toward them from the southern pass. Eirik quickened his pace, his boots sliding on the shifting, slick surface. Thora drew her sword, the blade humming as it cut through the encroaching wall of mist. She did not fear the storm. She only feared the loss of her prize. Eirik stepped onto the solid rock of the far ledge, his legs finally giving out beneath him. He collapsed against the cold, unyielding stone, his vision fading into a deep, dark gray. Thora stepped over his prone body, her gaze fixed on the ancient beacon ahead. She ignored his suffering, her attention entirely consumed by the promise of the hidden world. Eirik closed his eyes, his mind drifting into the silence of the stars. He had mapped the path, but the cost had been more than he ever dared to imagine. The canyon floor leveled out into a sprawling hidden basin. Eirik pulled his tattered cloak tighter against the biting wind. He checked the position of the stars through the shifting gray haze. His guild-issued map showed only a blank, impassable void here, yet a lush valley stretched out before his weary eyes. Thora halted the column with a sharp, imperious gesture. She scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowing at the impossible topography. Eirik stepped forward, his boots crunching on ancient weathered stone. He spotted a collapsed ruin tucked against the jagged cliff face. He moved toward the debris, his heart hammering against his ribs. He cleared away a layer of gray dust with trembling hands. Beneath the rubble lay a cache of preserved, leather-bound scrolls. He unrolled the topmost parchment with extreme, practiced caution. The map depicted the entire continent of Aethelgard in minute detail. It showed trade routes that the Iron Guild claimed did not exist. Eirik stared at the ink, his breath hitching in his constricted throat. He realized the guild had been lying to the populace for decades. He quickly tucked the scrolls into his satchel, his fingers shaking. A shadow fell over him, blocking the dim, filtered light. A scout named Kale stood behind him, a greedy smirk on his face. Kale had seen the hidden stash and the look of triumph on Eirik's face. The man stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. He demanded a share of the treasure Eirik had just uncovered. Eirik looked at the scout, his expression a mask of feigned submission. He pointed toward a shimmering, translucent patch of moss ahead. He claimed the most valuable relics lay buried near the center. Kale did not hesitate, his eyes gleaming with immediate, hollow avarice. The scout strode onto the moss, his heavy boots crushing the surface. The ground beneath him rippled like water under a sudden, heavy stone. Eirik watched the surface tension break with a sickening, wet snap. The sinkhole opened instantly, swallowing Kale into the pitch-black depths. The scout's scream was cut short by the sound of shifting gravel. Eirik stood at the precipice, his face pale and completely expressionless. He felt a heavy, cold weight settle deep within his tired soul. He adjusted his satchel, the ancient maps pressing against his side. He turned back toward the expedition, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Thora turned, her gaze sweeping the area for the missing scout. She asked Eirik where the man had wandered off to in the fog. Eirik lied with a calm, steady voice that betrayed no inner turmoil. He gestured toward a distant, treacherous pass obscured by thick vapor. Thora grunted, her suspicion lingering in the sharp set of her jaw. She ordered the group to march onward toward the distant beacon. Eirik followed, his steps heavy with the burden of his secret. He looked up at the void stars, his mind tracing their cold, distant paths. The celestial migraine began to pulse behind his tired, aching eyes. He ignored the pain, his focus locked on the survival of the truth. The valley behind them faded into the swirling, encroaching gray mist. He felt like a stranger in his own skin, hardened by necessity. He clutched his notebook, the only map he would truly trust anymore. The Iron Guild continued their march, oblivious to the history he carried. He was the only one who saw the world as it actually was. He would protect the maps, even if it cost him his humanity. The path ahead grew steep, winding upward into the jagged mountain peaks. Eirik's legs burned, but he kept his rhythm perfectly in check. He counted the steps, his internal compass locking onto the unseen stars. The wind howled through the crags, carrying the scent of ozone. Thora moved beside him, a predator waiting for a moment of weakness. She watched his hands, looking for any sign of the stolen scrolls. Eirik kept his arms crossed, shielding the satchel from her sharp eyes. He knew that discovery meant his immediate and violent death. He focused on the horizon, where the beacon flickered like a dying ember. The sky darkened, the gray mist turning to a deep, bruised purple. A fog storm began to brew, the air growing heavy with static. Eirik checked his internal rhythm, sensing the shift in the magnetic field. He realized the storm would force them to move at a faster pace. He led the way, his feet finding the solid ground with unerring precision. Thora followed closely, her hand never straying far from her steel blade. She sensed his confidence, her own uncertainty momentarily eclipsed by greed. They reached a narrow ledge that hung over a bottomless, silent gorge. Eirik paused, his eyes scanning the rock for the path of least resistance. He saw the faint, glowing trail of minerals left by ancient travelers. He stepped onto the ledge, the rock groaning under his slight weight. The group followed, their breath coming in short, ragged, anxious gasps. Eirik felt the familiar tug of the stars, pulling his mind outward. He slipped into the trance, his consciousness expanding into the vast void. He saw the topography of the entire region laid out in glowing lines. He navigated the ledge with the grace of a man walking his home. Thora watched him, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and malice. She realized he was more than a tool. He was an absolute necessity. She decided to keep him alive until the final destination was reached. Eirik felt her gaze, a cold pressure against the back of his neck. He finished the crossing, his boots hitting the solid, flat plateau beyond. He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders releasing in a slow, jagged wave. They were safe for the moment, but the path ahead remained treacherous. He looked at the scrolls in his bag, a silent vow in his heart. He would see these maps reach those who deserved to hold them. The expedition settled into a camp, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows. Eirik sat apart from the others, his notebook open on his lap. He scribbled notes, masking the truth with layers of complex, false data. He was a master of his craft, weaving lies into the fabric of reality. The night air grew cold, the stars above shining with a harsh, piercing light. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting into the silence of the abyss. He knew the guild was coming, but he was prepared for the end. The cycle of the stars continued, indifferent to the lives below them. He was a cartographer of fate, mapping a world that was dying. The sky curdled into a bruised, sickly violet. A wall of dense, oily fog slammed into the plateau. The wind shrieked like a dying beast, tearing at the camp's canvas tents. Iron Guild scouts scrambled, their echo stones chiming in erratic, frantic bursts. The devices glowed a dull, useless amber before flickering into total darkness. Thora stood near the center of the camp, her hand tight on her sword hilt. She scanned the swirling gray void, her face twisted in a sharp, predatory sneer. Eirik watched the chaos from the perimeter, his pulse syncing with the distant, hidden stars. The fog storm swallowed the world, erasing the horizon in a blink. He knelt in the dirt, his fingers tracing a complex geometric pattern onto the frozen ground. A sharp, metallic tang of ozone filled the air. He closed his eyes, focusing on the faint, rhythmic pulses of the void stars above the storm. His vision blurred, replaced by a mental map of glowing, shifting ley lines. A thin trickle of dark blood escaped his left nostril. He stood up, his legs shaking under the sudden, crushing weight of the calculation. He pointed toward a jagged shadow looming in the distance. Thora marched toward him, her boots crunching on the brittle, frost-covered stones. She barked an order, demanding to know if he had found a way out. Eirik ignored her, his eyes fixed on a narrow, dark crevice in the cliffside. He stepped forward, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The expedition team followed, their faces pale and slick with freezing moisture. They stumbled through the biting gale, clutching their useless, silent echo stones. Eirik reached the cave entrance and collapsed against the rough, damp stone wall. His world turned to static, the colors bleeding out of his vision until only shadow remained. He blinked, but the darkness stayed, thick and absolute. He reached out, his hands trembling as he touched the cold, jagged rock. He realized his sight had failed him entirely. Thora grabbed his shoulder, her grip bruising and firm. She dragged him deeper into the cave, away from the howling, lethal wind outside. The scouts crowded into the cavern, their heavy breathing filling the small, enclosed space. Thora shoved Eirik against the wall and leaned in close. Her breath smelled of stale iron and expensive, bitter tea. She whispered that he was the only one who could guide them back. She warned him that his life depended on his ability to see the path. Eirik felt the blood dry on his upper lip, his head throbbing with a rhythmic, pulsing agony. He sat in the dark, listening to the soft, rhythmic drips of water against the floor. He knew he was a prisoner of his own internal map. Hours dragged by in a suffocating, silent crawl. Eirik's vision returned in jagged, blurry fragments of gray and white. He looked up at Thora, who sat sharpening her blade by a small, hidden flame. She looked at him with an expression of cold, calculated indifference. She spoke of the mission, her voice devoid of any pretense of warmth. She revealed that the guild never intended for the expedition to return. The maps they carried were merely a ruse to justify the area as an unmapped casualty zone. They would be erased from the records, leaving the territory unclaimed and ripe for the guild's total monopoly. Eirik stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized he was a ghost in the making. Thora smiled, a sharp, thin line that never reached her cold, unblinking eyes. She told him he was the only witness who could confirm their existence. She stood up, the firelight casting long, monstrous shadows across the cave walls. She walked toward the entrance, her silhouette blocking the faint, flickering light of the storm. Eirik clutched his notebook, his fingers digging into the worn leather binding. He knew he had to escape before the storm broke, and the hunt began. He moved toward the shadows, his footsteps silent on the damp, uneven floor. Thora turned, her head tilting slightly as she sensed a shift in the air. Eirik froze, his breath catching in his throat as he pressed himself into a crevice. She scanned the darkness, her hand hovering over the hilt of her steel blade. She muttered a curse, then returned to her vigil at the cave mouth. Eirik slipped into the tunnel, the air turning frigid and thin. He crawled through the narrow passage, the rock scraping against his skin and clothes. He felt the pull of the void stars, their rhythm guiding him toward a distant, hidden exit. He was the only one who could see the true shape of Aethelgard. He would survive, even if he had to burn his own memories to find the way. Eirik crept through the narrow, twisting tunnel of the mountain base. The air grew thick with the acrid chemical scent of burning magnesium. He looked up at the ceiling of the cavern. Small, metallic canisters clung to the rock face, venting a sickly yellow smoke. The vapor drifted toward the cave entrance, obscuring the night sky. Eirik touched the rough stone of the wall. He realized the guild was burning flares to blind the heavens. The smoke created an artificial shroud that blocked the light of the void stars. He turned his attention to the floor beneath his boots. He watched the way dust motes drifted against the natural pull of the cavern. The ground vibrated with a subtle, rhythmic thrumming. He understood the gravity drift of the continent was shifting beneath his feet. He closed his eyes and felt the magnetic tug of the earth. His mind mapped the unseen paths of the landscape without the need for stars. He crawled toward the outer perimeter of the camp. 3 low-ranked scouts huddled near a dying fire. Their faces looked gaunt and hollowed by weeks of starvation. Eirik approached them, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled a folded parchment from his heavy coat. He whispered that he held the true map of the shattered wilds. The scouts leaned in, their eyes widening at the intricate glowing ink. He promised them a life beyond the reach of the Iron Guild. The lead scout reached for his belt, his hand trembling with hesitation. Eirik pointed to the ridgeline in the distance. He claimed the land held enough resources to sustain a city for generations. The scouts exchanged a long, meaningful look. They stood up, their hands gripping their weapons with new resolve. Eirik led them toward the main armory. He signaled for silence as they passed a sleeping guard. They reached the supply crate stacked against the cavern wall. Eirik pulled a hidden compartment open, revealing a starving carrier falcon. He attached a small wax-sealed cylinder to the bird's leg. He whispered a command and released the creature into the swirling fog. The falcon beat its wings once and vanished into the gray abyss. He watched the bird disappear, knowing the truth was now bound for the capital. A sudden, sharp, metallic clang echoed through the cavern. Thora stood at the far end of the tunnel, her hand resting on her sword. She stared at the group with eyes that burned like cold embers. She stepped forward, her armor clinking against the damp stone. She remarked that the silence of the camp was far too heavy. Eirik stepped in front of the scouts, his posture rigid and defiant. He told her that the guild's monopoly on the wilds was finished. Thora laughed, a dry, humorless sound that chilled the stagnant air. She drew her blade, the steel shimmering with a lethal blue light. She warned him that ghosts had no place in her new world. Eirik stood his ground, his mind already calculating the gravity drift. He knew the floor beneath Thora was unstable and prone to collapse. He stomped his heel against a specific hollow crack in the stone. The ground groaned, a low tectonic rumble rising from the depths. Thora stumbled, her balance faltering as the floor tilted violently. She lunged toward him, her blade slicing through the empty space. Eirik ducked, the steel whistling inches above his head. He shoved the scouts toward the hidden exit tunnel. He looked back at the commander, his gaze steady and cold. He revealed that the map was already in the hands of the authorities. Thora froze, her face contorting with a flash of genuine rage. She realized the expedition was no longer a secret, but a crime. Eirik turned and sprinted into the darkness of the mountain. He felt the mountain shift, the gravity drift pulling him toward safety. The floor behind him gave way, sealing the path with a wall of rock. He was alone in the deep, silent veins of the earth. He placed his hand against the wall and felt the heartbeat of Aethelgard. He was the only one who could read the final hidden meridian. He began his descent into the uncharted heart of the continent. Thora did not hesitate. She swung her blade in a clean silver arc. The lead scout collapsed to the stone floor. His blood pooled against the jagged dark rock. Eirik watched the light fade from the man's eyes. He tightened his grip on his leather-bound notebook. Thora turned her gaze toward the tunnel's shadow. She wiped her crimson blade on a scrap of silk. Eirik turned and bolted into the pitch-black corridor. His boots pounded against the uneven, slick stone. He rounded a corner and felt the air pressure drop. A stray boulder caught his ankle with a sickening snap. He tumbled forward into a bed of razor-sharp shale. Pain shot up his leg like a bolt of white lightning. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He limped into the deeper, uncharted veins of the cave. The tunnel narrowed until he had to crawl on his elbows. He paused to press his palm against the cold, weeping wall. He closed his eyes to locate the rhythm of the void stars. A sharp, metallic spike of agony pierced his temples. A thin line of blood trickled from his left nostril. He wiped the stain away with his trembling sleeve. The stellar migraine clouded his vision in pulsing violet hues. He forced his mind to track the magnetic pull of the earth. Behind him, the distant sound of heavy boots echoed. Thora's trackers moved through the dark with practiced precision. Eirik dragged his injured leg through the suffocating silt. He reached a cavernous chamber lit by bioluminescent moss. He collapsed behind a pillar of translucent, jagged quartz. His notebook felt heavy and wet with his own sweat. He opened the pages and traced the lines of his celestial map. The ink glowed faintly against the dim, green cave light. He realized his calculations were the only path to the surface. He heard the rhythmic clicking of an echo stone nearby. The device hummed with a distorted synthetic frequency. The sound grew louder as a shadow fell across the moss. Eirik held his breath and pressed his back to the quartz. He watched a hooded figure enter the subterranean clearing. The stranger wore a cloak embroidered with a rusted compass. He recognized the mark of the radical free surveyors. The man tapped a metallic rod against the cavern floor. The rod emitted a soft, golden pulse of pure energy. Eirik saw the man stop and stare at the empty air. The stranger muttered that the star path was finally bleeding through. Eirik realized they had been watching his trail for days. He shifted his weight, his injured leg scraping against stone. The stranger spun around, his hand hovering over a flintlock. Eirik raised his hands, the notebook clutched in his fingers. He told the stranger that he held the final meridian map. The man's eyes widened as he caught the scent of old parchment. He lowered his weapon and gestured toward a hidden door. The wall of the cave slid open with a mechanical hiss. Eirik hobbled into a room filled with brass astrolabes. Tables were covered in salvaged parts from broken guild tech. The man introduced himself as a scout for the free surveyors. He claimed his faction had waited years for a true navigator. Eirik looked at the complex, unstable machinery on the desks. He saw the flaws in their crude imitation navigation systems. They lacked the human cost of his own celestial triangulation. He sat on a wooden crate and clutched his throbbing head. The stranger poured a dark, bitter liquid into a tin cup. He said the guild would burn the world to possess his mind. Eirik drank the liquid and felt a dull numbness in his limbs. He knew he was a prisoner in a different kind of cage. He placed his notebook on the table as a sign of truce. The stranger opened the book and gasped at the hand-drawn stars. Outside the base, the distant sound of combat erupted. Thora's elite trackers had breached the outer defensive perimeter. The air vibrated with the discharge of high-velocity guild rifles. Eirik stood up, his leg throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache. He grabbed his notebook and shoved it back into his coat. He knew he could not trust these scavengers with his life. He limped toward a ventilation shaft located near the ceiling. He climbed the rusted iron rungs with his remaining strength. He looked down at the chaos unfolding in the hidden base. Thora entered the room, her armor stained with fresh soot. She scanned the chamber, her eyes cold and predatory. She spotted the empty crate where Eirik had been sitting. She kicked the table, sending the brass instruments crashing down. Eirik squeezed into the narrow, dark tunnel of the shaft. He crawled upward, the metal biting into his bruised skin. He felt the magnetic shift of the continent beneath the mountain. The gravity drift pulled him toward the freezing open air. He reached a grate and kicked it outward into the night. He tumbled onto a ridge overlooking the shattered wilds. The fog storm swirled below him like a living gray ocean. He stood on the ledge and looked at the distant horizon. He was alone, hunted, and armed only with his own memories. He began the long, painful trek toward the unknown peaks. Eirik watched the leader of the free surveyors pace across the chamber. The man's boots clicked against the uneven stone floor. He gestured toward a map pinned to the wall with jagged iron nails. The map depicted the shattered wilds in terrifying, tactical detail. The leader claimed the guild held the trade routes captive with their lies. He traced a finger over a mountain pass glowing with phantom ink. He stated that with Eirik's celestial data, they would seize the choke points. Eirik gripped the edge of the wooden table. His knuckles turned white under the strain. He saw a pile of volatile explosives stacked near the exit. These men did not want to map the world to save it. They wanted to rig the geography to trap the guild's supply chains. He realized he had traded one set of chains for another. The leader turned and offered Eirik a quill stained with ink. He demanded that Eirik verify the coordinates for the northern ridge. Eirik took the quill, his hand steadying against the rough wood. He leaned over the map and squinted at the lines. He saw a fatal error in their triangulation of the magnetic pole. He dipped the quill into the ink and began to write. He intentionally skewed the longitude by 3 degrees. He added a false note about an unstable sinkhole near the pass. He made the error look like a minor calculation drift. He handed the parchment back to the scout. The man studied the numbers with a greedy, narrow-eyed intensity. He signaled to his subordinates to prepare the demolition charges. Eirik watched them pack their gear into heavy, iron-bound crates. The air in the chamber grew thick with the smell of sulfur. A sudden, sharp vibration rattled the brass astrolabes on the desk. The floor groaned as if something massive moved far above. Eirik pressed his palm to the wall and felt a rhythmic thud. The ground shuddered again, harder this time. Dust rained down from the ceiling in a fine gray curtain. A scout rushed into the room, his face pale with panic. He shouted that the Iron Guild had breached the outer ridge. Thora's forces were closing in. The leader of the Free Surveyors drew a serrated blade from his belt. He looked at Eirik with eyes that turned cold and calculating. He commanded his men to secure the navigator at all costs. Eirik backed away until he hit the cold, damp stone. He saw the scout leveling a flintlock pistol at his chest. The man warned him that he was now their only insurance policy. Eirik felt the familiar throb of a stellar migraine behind his eyes. He reached into his coat and felt the hard edge of his notebook. He knew he had to lead them into the dead zone. He told the leader that the only way to escape was through the shifting fog. The leader hesitated, glancing at the approaching sounds of battle. Eirik pointed toward the ventilation shaft he had used earlier. He lied, claiming the shaft led to a stable subterranean corridor. The leader shoved his pistol into his holster and signaled his men to follow. They moved into the darkness, the scout keeping a hand on Eirik's shoulder. Eirik stepped into the narrow tunnel, his leg dragging with every step. He could hear the metallic clatter of Thora's armor in the chamber behind them. He felt the magnetic pull of the earth shifting beneath his boots. He forced his mind to sync with the invisible void stars. His vision blurred, and a streak of blood appeared on his lip. He wiped it away, his fingers trembling in the dark. He kept his rhythm steady, guiding the scavengers deeper into the mountain. The tunnel opened into a vast, silent cavern. The walls shimmered with a pale, unnatural light. Eirik stopped and raised his hand to signal a halt. He whispered that the magnetic interference was at its peak here. The leader pulled out an echo stone to check the path. The device emitted a high-pitched, discordant screech before failing completely. The screen went dark, and the casing began to smoke. The leader cursed and threw the useless stone against the wall. Eirik stood in the center of the cavern, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He saw the alignment of the stars shifting through a crack in the rock. He knew this was the heart of the magnetic dead zone. He turned to the leader and warned him to stand perfectly still. He claimed that one wrong step would trigger a gravity collapse. The leader froze, his eyes darting toward the darkness. From the tunnel behind them, the sound of heavy footsteps grew louder. Thora's voice echoed through the cavern, sharp and commanding. She shouted for Eirik to reveal himself. The leader of the scavengers leveled his rifle toward the tunnel entrance. He told Eirik to stay behind the line of fire. Eirik slipped into the shadows, his notebook clutched to his chest. He watched as Thora entered the cavern with 6 armored soldiers. She held a glowing lantern that cut through the gloom. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the group of scavengers. She did not see Eirik hiding behind a cluster of quartz pillars. She spoke with a voice that sounded like grinding metal. She demanded the surrender of the navigator and the stolen maps. The leader of the Free Surveyors laughed, a dry and brittle sound. He told her that Eirik was no longer a servant of the guild. Thora signaled her men to raise their rifles. The cavern erupted in a flash of blinding white energy. Eirik pressed his back into the quartz, his breath hitching in his throat. He saw the air warp as the weapons discharged. The scavengers returned fire, their explosives lighting the chamber. Eirik watched the chaos, his mind mapping the trajectory of the debris. He knew the ceiling was structurally unsound. He waited for the right moment to strike the final blow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic shard. He threw the shard at a specific weathered stalactite above the combatants. The metal struck the stone with a sharp, resonant chime. A hairline fracture appeared, snaking rapidly across the ceiling. The rock groaned and began to descend. Eirik turned and scrambled toward a narrow crawl space near the floor. Dust and rubble crashed down, sealing the tunnel entrance. The screams of the soldiers were cut short by the roar of the collapse. He crawled into the tight, dark gap and did not look back. He emerged into a small, quiet pocket of the mountain. He sat on the floor, his chest heaving with exertion. He pulled his notebook out and opened it to a blank page. He began to draw the true map of the region. He knew both factions would soon dig themselves out of the rubble. He had to be gone before they realized the path he gave them was a trap. He looked up at the ceiling, tracing the path of the stars. The void stars seemed to pulse with a warning. He realized the map he was drawing was changing. The land itself was shifting faster than he had calculated. He stood up, his leg burning with a dull, persistent ache. He walked into the dark, toward the unknown horizon. He was the only one who could navigate the end of Aethelgard. He clutched his book and stepped out into the biting, freezing wind. The fog storm waited for him like a hungry beast. The fog storm clawed at the mountain pass like a living thing. Eirik Vinterdal limped over the jagged basalt, his breath hitching in the freezing air. Behind him, the heavy thud of boots signaled the approaching Iron Guild soldiers. Thora Hraffin led the charge, her hand gripping the hilt of her blade. She scanned the horizon, her face twisted in a mask of calculated fury. Eirik paused by a monolith of black obsidian, his fingers tracing a faint, etched star chart. He looked up at the sky, where the void stars flickered with a sickening, pale violet hue. He knew this was the threshold of the magnetic dead zone. He stepped across the invisible line, and his own internal rhythm shuddered. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and crushed stone. Thora and her men crossed the threshold seconds later, their echo stones chiming once before shattering in their hands. The soldiers stumbled, their equipment sparking and going dark. Thora cursed, shaking her wrist where the useless device hung like a dead weight. Eirik turned to face them, his notebook held open to a page of shifting, ink-drawn constellations. He told them the terrain ahead was a gravity trap that only he could bridge. Thora leveled her pistol at his chest, her eyes burning with a desperate, hollow greed. She demanded he lead them to the map's final coordinates. Eirik pointed toward a chasm where the ground drifted in slow, vertical circles. He warned her that a single misplaced step would tear their bodies apart. Thora's men hesitated, their rifles trembling in the grip of the chaotic magnetic field. Eirik watched the stars above, his mind burning as he calculated the lethal drift of the crust. A drop of blood leaked from his nose, staining the corner of his map. He told them the continent was shifting, and only his guidance could keep the ground beneath their feet. He claimed the guild's monopoly was a death sentence for everyone in Aethelgard. Thora's face paled as she realized the reality of their isolation. She lowered her weapon, sensing the terrifying silence of the dead zone. Eirik turned back to the abyss, his eyes reflecting the dying light of the constellations. He saw the alignment of the stars shifting in a way that defied all known geometry. The sky was not just moving, it was unraveling. He realized the maps he drew were merely delaying a collapse that had already begun. The world was not waiting for them to conquer it. The world was simply falling away into the dark. You watch the screen, but you aren't just observing a map or a dying world. You are standing in the same fog, waiting for a path that will never appear. The stars you see tonight are moving, shifting just like his, and you are already lost.